Hi, my friends. Tonight we're diving into the rustic, resourceful kitchens of medieval peasants. Picture this: the sun setting. Over a thatched roof village, the air smells faintly of damp hay, and somewhere a pot of bubbling stew is filling the air with earthy, herbal warmth. For the everyday farmer, food wasn't just fuel, it was survival ingenuity and maybe a dash of luck. But here's the kicker: you probably wouldn't last a week eating like this. Think gruel so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl, or a loaf of bread tough enough to double as a weapon. Romanticized its all quaint countryside charm. The reality, though, was far grittier. Before you sink into your pillow, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Got a strange bit of history you want to hear before bed? Drop it in the comments. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself at the heart of peasant life, a simple one-room cottage with a smoky hearth and rough wooden furniture. In the center of the room, a single pot hangs over the fire, emitting steam as its contents simmer. This is pottage, the unassuming, unrelenting workhorse of medieval cuisine. At its most basic, pottage was a stew of whatever could be gathered grains like barley or oats roots such as turnips and a smattering of wild greens. If luck smiled, a bone or two might lend its flavor to the mix. Meat. Well, let's not get carried away. For most peasants, meat was a luxury reserved for feast days or when an animal was too old to work. Pottage wasn't just food, it was a lifestyle. Its ingredients changed with the seasons. In the spring, nettles and young dandelion greens might add a fresh if slightly bitter note. Come autumn, parsnips, leeks, and cabbage filled the pot. The recipe: more of a survival strategy than a culinary statement. Whatever's edible goes in. You stir the pot gently, watching the broth thicken. Historians still argue whether pottage's longevity was due to its versatility or sheer necessity. One thing's certain: it was endlessly adaptable. Recipes passed down through generations were less about flavor profiles and more about the economics of keeping a household fed. Now imagine a day's work on the farm. Hours spent plowing fields or herding sheep meant meals had to be hearty enough to sustain you, but cheap enough not to bankrupt the family. Pottage rose to the occasion like a knight to battle. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some households kept the same pot of pottage simmering for days, just adding new ingredients as needed. If you think leftover lasagna is magical, wait until you've met medieval perpetual stew. There's a rhythm to this dish, a sense of continuity that reflects peasant life itself. Each meal connects to the one before it, just as the land connects to the seasons. You ladle a portion into a wooden bowl, the steam curling into the air. The flavor? Simple, earthy, and deeply satisfying, if not exactly Michelin-starred. As the pot simmers, you think of how pottage played a starring role in medieval feasts as well. During communal gatherings, large cauldrons bubbled with richer versions of the dish, often containing prized ingredients like pork or goose. Of course, these events were rare. On most days, your pottage remained humble. You take another bite and ponder how this dish might have shaped history. Could its simplicity have contributed to the resilience of medieval communities? Or was it the peasants' willingness to make do with what they had that truly defined their survival? The hearth crackles softly as the last rays of sunlight filter through the cottage's tiny window. With a belly warmed by pottage, you lean back and feel an odd sense of connection, not just to the past, but to the resourcefulness and endurance of the human spirit. As the morning light spills over fields of rye and barley, you rise to the smell of something far less glamorous than your favorite breakfast pastry, black bread. It's dense, coarse, and dark as the soil it came from. Yet for medieval peasants, this wasn't just a meal, it was a cornerstone of survival. Picture yourself tearing into a loaf, fresh from the oven. The crust is thick and hard-baked, to endure days or even weeks of storage. Inside the crumb is chewy, dotted with uneven pockets, where coarse rye flour and a little water met. If you're lucky, there's a faint sour tang, the result of wild fermentation, though the word delicacy would be a stretch. Bread was everywhere in the medieval diet. For peasants, it wasn't a side, it was the main event. In fact, black bread made from rye or barley was so fundamental that it was often the first food peasants ate as children and the last they clung to in famine. You begin to slice into the loaf, feeling its resistance under your knife. Historians still argue whether the term black bread was more about its color or its metaphorical heaviness reflecting the struggles of those who consumed it. Either way, it wasn't made for indulgence. This bread, born from the toil of plowing, sowing, and harvesting, was as much a laborer as the people who ate it. The recipe simple. Rye or barley flour, water, salt if available, and a touch of sourdough starter if you were feeling fancy. Wheat was out of reach for most peasants, reserved for nobles and clergy. If you were lucky, your bread might include some dried peas or lentils ground into the mix for extra protein. But let's not romanticize it too much. Sometimes stretching the dough meant adding whatever fillers were on hand, acorns, ground bark, or even dried moss. Yes, medieval peasants quite literally made ends meet with whatever the land grudgingly provided. As you chew, the flavor is, well, rustic. The bread is hearty, satisfying in its way, but it clings to your teeth and demands a sip of thin ale or watered-down cider to wash it down. This wasn't just food, it was fuel. A single loaf could power a farmer through hours of plowing or hauling stones. Yet black bread wasn't merely a solitary experience. It was also communal, often baked in shared village ovens to save resources. Each family brought their own dough marked with a unique design or token to identify their loaves. The village oven became a hub of social connection, with neighbors exchanging stories while the bread baked. And here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval bread was so central to daily life that it influenced the very language we speak. The word lord comes from Old English hlafword, meaning loaf warden or bread keeper, symbolizing the person responsible for feeding others. As the day progresses, you realize just how versatile this humble loaf was. Stale bread could be softened in soups or stews, and crumbs were used as thickeners or toppings for dishes. In lean times, bread was even turned into a crude kind of pudding, mixed with whatever milk or honey might be on hand. The crack of the crust echoes as you finish the last piece, and you're struck by how enduring this staple has been. Even today, rye bread appears in bakeries worldwide, though it's far removed from the gritty loaves of medieval Europe. You imagine the peasants who relied on it working the fields under the hot sun, carrying their daily ration of bread in a woven basket. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life-sustaining. And as the saying goes, where there's bread, there's hope. The sun rises higher, casting long shadows across the land. You take a moment to appreciate this simple yet vital food, its legacy woven into the fabric of human history. As the day stretches on, your mind drifts to another staple of medieval peasant life: pottage. If bread was the backbone of their diet, pottage was its dependable warming heart. The scent of it fills your imagined kitchen, earthy, savory, and just a little smoky from the open hearth. Pottage was not just food. It was an evolving story, simmering away in a clay pot over smoldering embers. You picture yourself tending to it, occasionally stirring with a wooden spoon as the ingredients meld into a thick, hearty stew. This was medieval meal prep at its finest: simple, flexible, and frugal. What's in the pot today? A handful of barley, some root vegetables, and maybe a few foraged greens. Medieval peasants were masters of improvisation, and pottage could be as varied as the seasons. In spring, wild garlic and nettles might add a vibrant kick. By late autumn, you'd rely on hardy turnips and parsnips pulled from the frosted earth. Meat was a rare addition saved for special occasions, or offered sparingly in the form of a bone or scraps to flavor the pot. It wasn't just thriftiness that kept meat off the menu. Medieval farming practices prioritized livestock for milk, wool, and labor over their value as food. A chicken might produce dozens of eggs, but only one meal if slaughtered. As the pottage thickens, you add a sprinkle of salt if you're lucky enough to have it. Salt was a luxury often imported and taxed heavily. For most peasants, herbs like thyme or parsley served as the primary seasoning. And if the stew turned out bland, well, hunger was the best spice of all. There's something comforting about the slow rhythm of pottage making. It's a dish that takes its time like the medieval life it sustained. You can imagine the scene: a family gathered around the hearth sharing stories as the stew bubbles gently. The pottage itself, shared communally, becomes more than food. It's a symbol of togetherness, of scraping by as a unit. But this simplicity belied a surprising sophistication. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had a better understanding of nutritional balance than we give them credit for. Pottage was in many ways a perfect meal. The grains provided energy, the vegetables supplied essential vitamins, and the occasional legume or dairy addition added protein. And then there's the ingenuity. Leftovers weren't just reheated, they were reinvented. Yesterday's pottage could be thickened into a paste spread onto a slab of bread or even fried into rough patties. It was medieval sustainability and action waste, not whatnot. Of course not. All pottage was created equal. A wealthier household might add spices like saffron or ginger, their bright colors and pungent flavors a mark of status. For the average peasant, though, such luxuries were out of reach. Their pottage was earthy, straightforward, and deeply tied to the land. As you take a slow, deliberate spoonful, you're reminded of how much this dish tells us about medieval life. It speaks of resourcefulness, of lives attuned to the rhythms of nature, and of a resilience that carried people through harsh winters and lean harvests. The fire crackles softly and you let your thoughts wander. Imagine the countless variations of pottage across medieval Europe. In the north, oats might replace barley, thickening the stew into something closer to porridge. Further south, a splash of olive oil or a pinch of dried herbs could transform the flavor entirely. It's remarkable how something so humble could be so universal. Pottage wasn't flashy or indulgent, but it was dependable. It fed workers before dawn and comforted them after long days in the fields. It warmed families huddled in drafty cottages, their lives shaped by the cycles of planting and harvest. You set the spoon down, letting the last of the imagined warmth linger. The hearth's glow fades slightly as the day marches on, but the memory of pottage lingers, a dish born of necessity, yet rich in its quiet, sustaining power. As the sun casts its golden hues over the medieval fields, another staple food begins to take center stage: gruel. Now, gruel doesn't have the most glamorous reputation. Even the word itself might evoke images of watery bowls and weary sighs. But in the medieval world, gruel wasn't just a fallback, it was a lifeline. Imagine yourself ladling out a modest portion into a chipped wooden bowl. The mixture is thin, yes, but warm and filling in its own way. Gruel was the simplest and most accessible meal, requiring little more than ground grains, water, and a bit of heat. In many ways, it was the medieval version of fast food, quick, affordable, and widely available. You take a bite and taste the simplicity, soft, slightly nutty, and unadorned. It's not much to write home about, but when your body aches from labor and your stomach growls with hunger, it's exactly what you need. Gruel wasn't meant to dazzle, it was meant to sustain. What makes gruel so fascinating is how it bridged social divides. While the wealthiest lords feasted on roasted meats and spiced delicacies, they too might begin their day with a bowl of gruel, albeit made with richer grains and perhaps sweetened with honey. For peasants, gruel was a far more humble affair, often thickened with whatever was on hand: wild greens, dried peas, or a pinch of salt. But don't underestimate this dish. Gruel was highly adaptable. A handful of lentils could turn it into something heartier. A splash of milk might lend a creamy touch. And in particularly lean times, stretching a small portion of grain with extra water meant the difference between survival and starvation. As you stir the pot, you can't help but appreciate the ingenuity required to make gruel palatable. Medieval cooks, no matter how poor, found ways to add flavor and texture. You picture a woman tossing in a few wild herbs gathered from the hedgerows or stirring in a dollop of lard saved from the last slaughter. These small additions transformed gruel from mere sustenance into something approaching a meal. And yet gruel was more than just food. It was a reflection of the times. The thinness of the dish mirrored the fragility of medieval life, where abundance could vanish overnight due to a failed harvest or an unexpected war. Gruel reminded people of their precarious place in the world, yet it also symbolized resilience, a way to stretch resources and make do with less. Historians still argue whether gruel played a role in shaping medieval health. Some suggest that its simplicity and lack of excess made it easier to digest, offering a kind of nutritional balance that richer foods couldn't provide. Others believe it was a sign of hardship, a daily reminder of what people lacked rather than what they had. As you savor another spoonful, your thoughts drift to the communal aspect of gruel. It was often cooked in large pots shared among family members, neighbors, or even entire villages. There's a sense of camaraderie in this act of people coming together to share what little they had. Imagine the conversations that took place around the hearth, the laughter and stories that made the thin meal feel more filling. You're struck by how gruel ties into the broader tapestry of medieval cuisine. It was the base layer, the starting point from which other dishes emerged. Add some leftover vegetables and you had pottage. Stir in a bit of cheese and it became porridge. The boundaries between these dishes were fluid, shaped by the availability of ingredients and the creativity of the cook. Gruel also had its place in the rhythm of the medieval day. It was often eaten for breakfast, providing a warm, simple start to the morning, before the long hours of labor began. But it wasn't just for peasants. Monks in their austere monasteries relied on gruel as a staple of their diets, seeing it as a symbol of humility and discipline. As you imagine the pot emptying, you're left with a newfound respect for this unassuming dish. Gruel may not be glamorous, but it's a testament to the resourcefulness and adaptability of the human spirit. It kept people going day after day through hard times and lean years. The pot now cleaned, and the hearth smoldering softly, you take a moment to reflect. Gruel, like so many medieval foods, was more than just sustenance. It was a lifeline, a connection to the land, and a quiet symbol of endurance. And as you drift into thought, you can almost hear the gentle clatter of bowls and the murmur of voices from centuries past sharing a simple, humble meal. As the quiet hum of medieval life continues, your gaze turns to another staple dish of the peasant diet: pottage. Unlike gruel, pottage was more of a hearty stew, brimming with the potential for variety and flavor. Its name alone evokes warmth, a bubbling cauldron over a smoky hearth, the air heavy with the scent of slow-cooked vegetables and herbs. You dip a wooden ladle into the pot and scoop up a mixture that seems to promise comfort. Pottage wasn't a specific recipe, but rather a catch-all term for whatever could be tossed into the pot. Its beauty lay in its adaptability: a little barley, some wild greens, perhaps a turnip or two. And if luck smiled upon you, a piece of salted meat or a bone for flavor. As you bring the ladle to your lips, the taste is earthy grounding, an honest reflection of the land and the season. In summer, pottage could be vibrant with fresh vegetables and wild herbs. In winter, it leaned heavier on root vegetables and dried legumes, the flavors deep and enduring. What makes pottage so fascinating is its democratic nature. Like gruel, it was a dish for everyone, but its variations told stories of wealth and privilege. For peasants, pottage was often thin stretched with water and whatever scraps were available. For wealthier households, the addition of exotic spices or tender cuts of meat transformed it into something far more luxurious. You stir the pot again, marveling at the ingenuity behind it. Pottage wasn't just food, it was a strategy. It allowed medieval cooks to use every part of their ingredients, from the tops of carrot to the last bits of bread crumbled in for thickness. In a time when waste could mean hunger, nothing was discarded. Imagine yourself sitting at a rough-hewn table as the family gathers for their evening meal. Pottage is ladled into bowls, the steam rising as everyone digs in. There's a rhythm to it, a shared understanding that this dish, humble as it may be, is what sustains them. And yet pottage was more than just a meal. It was a reflection of the seasons. In the spring it might be light and green, bursting with the first shoots and leaves of the year. By autumn it grew richer with pumpkins and squash lending their warmth. The dish evolved as the year turned, adapting to the cycles of planting and harvest. Historians still argue about the precise origins of pottage. Some see it as an extension of ancient cooking practices, a natural evolution of humanity's earliest soups and stews. Others believe its prominence in medieval life was a direct response to the challenges of the feudal system, where peasants needed meals that were both economical and filling. You can't help but notice the communal aspect of pottage. It wasn't just a dish, it was an event. A large pot often simmered all day, fed by contributions from multiple households. Someone might bring a handful of barley, another a few onions, and someone else a sprig of thyme. The resulting meal was shared, each bite carrying a little piece of everyone's effort. And then there's the ingenuity required to make pottage flavorful. Medieval cooks were masters of improvisation, adding a splash of vinegar for tang, a pinch of salt for depth, or a handful of wild garlic for a kick. Even in the leanest times, they found ways to make the dish not just edible, but enjoyable. As the pot bubbles away, you're struck by how pottage ties into the broader narrative of medieval life. It was a dish that encouraged community, celebrated resourcefulness, and made the most of what the land provided. It's a reminder that even in the face of hardship, people found ways to nourish not just their bodies, but their spirits. And perhaps that's the true magic of pottage. It wasn't just about sustenance, it was about connection. Whether shared among a family or an entire village, it brought people together, reinforcing the bonds of community and the rhythms of daily life. The pot now emptied, the bowls scraped clean. You sit back and let the warmth of the meal settle in. Pottage may have been a simple dish, but it carried with it the complexity of medieval existence, the highs and lows, the challenges and triumphs, the deep connection to the land and to one another. And as the last embers of the hearth glow softly, you can almost hear the gentle laughter and murmured conversations of those who centuries ago found comfort in a bowl of pottage much as you have tonight. The crackling warmth of the hearth still lingers as the scent of another medieval meal takes its turn to weave into your senses rye bread. This wasn't the pillowy golden loaf you might find in modern bakeries, but rather a denser, darker, and sometimes grittier version of bread, one that symbolized survival and resilience. You take a seat on a sturdy wooden bench, feeling the coarse texture of a slice in your hand. Bread, after all, was life. For peasants in medieval times, rye bread wasn't just food, it was the cornerstone of every meal. Its creation was an art form born of necessity, dictated by the unpredictable rhythms of nature and the feudal obligations that shaped daily life. The rye grain thrived in the cooler, harsher climates of northern Europe, where wheat often struggled to grow. Its hardiness made it a dependable crop, resistant to the damp conditions and frost that could devastate other grains. And so rye became the hero of the medieval table, its flour transformed into dense loaves that could last for days or even weeks if needed. As you chew, the taste is earthy and slightly tangy with an edge that hints at fermentation. Rye bread was often made with sourdough starters, a process that not only enhanced its flavor, but also extended its shelf life. This was no accident. Medieval bakers understood the value of longevity. Bread wasn't just for today's meal, it was insurance for the days when nothing else was available. Picture a medieval kitchen, modest and functional. A wooden trough sits in the corner, filled with a sticky, bubbling mass of dough. The baker, hands dusted with flour kneads with a practiced rhythm, her movements both deliberate and meditative. The dough is shaped into rounds or oblong loaves, then placed in the glowing heat of a communal oven where the fire crackles and hisses. But rye bread wasn't without its challenges. In wet seasons, the grain could become infected with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations and even death. Historians still argue whether ergot poisoning played a role in strange historical events like the mass dancing plagues or the witch trials of later centuries. It's an eerie thought as you consider how something as simple as bread could carry such hidden dangers. Rye bread also tells a story of class. While peasants dined on the darker, coarser loaves, the wealthy enjoyed the luxury of white bread made from fine wheat flour. This stark contrast was as visible on the table as it was in daily life, a reminder of the rigid hierarchies that defined the medieval world. Even so, peasants made the best of their rye bread, often pairing it with whatever else was on hand. You can imagine a meal of bread and cheese, the sharp tang of goat's milk cheese, complementing the hearty loaf. Or perhaps it's bread and ale, the two staples forming a simple yet satisfying feast. There's an ingenuity in how medieval people used bread beyond just eating it. Stale slices became trenchers, doubling as edible plates for stews and meats. Once soaked with juices and softened, the bread was consumed, ensuring nothing went to waste. This practice of using trenchers is another example of how necessity drove creativity in the medieval kitchen. The communal aspect of bread also stands out. Ovens were often shared by entire villages with designated baking days that brought neighbors together. Imagine the scent of fresh loaves wafting through narrow streets, the chatter of women exchanging news and tips as they waited for their turn at the fire. It was a moment of connection, a brief pause in the relentless cycle of labor. As you take another bite, the dense texture seems to echo the resilience of those who relied on this bread to fuel their lives. It's a connection across centuries, a reminder of how food can carry the essence of a time and place. And then there's the role of bread in medieval rituals and superstitions. Rye loaves were sometimes used in religious offerings, their humble origins, elevating them to symbols of devotion and gratitude. Bread was also believed to hold protective powers, with pieces placed in doorways or crumbled over fields to ensure a good harvest. In every crumb there's a story. From the fields where the rye was sown to the hands that shaped the dough, rye bread encapsulates the spirit of medieval life, its struggles, its resourcefulness, and its unyielding hope. As the loaf dwindles, leaving only a few crumbs on the table, you feel a quiet appreciation for this humble staple. It's more than just sustenance, it's a testament to the resilience of those who came before us, who found strength and sustenance in even the simplest of meals. The fire flickers low, its light casting soft shadows on the walls. You lean back, the weight of history settling around you like a warm blanket. Rye bread may not be glamorous, but it carries with it the heart and soul of a people who found a way to thrive even in the harshest of times. The rhythmic clatter of wooden spoons against clay bowls brings you back to the medieval kitchen, where a new dish takes center stage: pottage. This humble, hearty stew was the ultimate medieval comfort food, a warm, nourishing concoction that sustained peasants through long days of labor and biting winters. You find yourself peering into a bubbling pot over the hearth, its contents thick and fragrant with a mix of ingredients that tell a story of resilience and creativity. Pottage was quite simply the great equalizer of medieval cuisine. Almost everyone, from the lowest peasant to the occasional noble on a frugal streak, partook in some version of this dish. It was versatile and economical, made with whatever ingredients were at hand: grains, vegetables, and sometimes, if luck smiled, a bit of meat. You can almost taste the medley, a savory harmony of earthy roots, chewy barley, and the occasional tang of wild herbs. You imagine the day beginning early, a peasant woman stirring the pot while the rest of the household readies for their work. The ingredients are modest leeks pulled fresh from the garden, dried peas soaked overnight, and a handful of wild greens foraged from the hedgerows. Over time, the flavors meld into something greater than the sum of their parts, a meal that's not just food, but also a source of comfort and strength. Pottage wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic of the resourcefulness that defined medieval life. In a time when food was scarce and survival often depended on adaptability, this dish embodied the idea of making do. It was a living recipe evolving with the seasons and the availability of ingredients. In summer, it might brim with fresh vegetables. In winter, it leaned heavily on dried beans and preserved roots. The base of pottage was almost always a grain: barley, oats, or rye, thickening the stew into a porridge-like consistency. These grains were a peasant's lifeline, filling and energy-packed, perfect for sustaining long hours in the fields. Picture a wooden ladle scooping up the thick, steaming mixture, the grains' subtle nuttiness balanced by the sweetness of carrots and parsnips. Occasionally, the pot might be graced with a luxury: a small piece of bacon, or a bone for flavor. The meat was rarely plentiful, and even a scrap was cherished. Its essence simmered out over hours to lend richness to the dish. You can almost see the family gathering around the pot, each member savoring their portion, knowing the value of every morsel. But not all pottage was created equal. For the wealthier, pottage could be a more elaborate affair, laden with spices, almonds, and exotic ingredients brought in by traders. The contrast between this and the simpler peasant version highlights the stark divides of medieval society, a reminder of how food was both sustenance and status symbol. Pottage also served as a community builder. In many villages, large communal pots were kept simmering, each family contributing what they could spare. This practice fostered a spirit of cooperation, a sense of shared responsibility in the face of hardship. Imagine the lively chatter around the communal pot, the exchange of stories and news as the stew thickened over the flames. And yet there was a darker side to pottage. During times of famine, when crops failed and larders ran dry, the pot might be filled with whatever could be scavenged: acorns, nettles, even the bark of trees. Historians still argue whether such desperate measures were common or exaggerated in the records, but the mere thought paints a vivid picture of the precariousness of medieval life. As you continue to taste the dish in your imagination, its flavors shifting with each bite, you're struck by how it embodies the rhythm of medieval life. The slow cooking process mirrored the slow pace of the agricultural calendar. The time spent stirring the pot, a reflection of the patience required to coax life from the land. The simplicity of pottage belies its complexity as a cultural artifact. It wasn't just food, it was a ritual, a tradition passed down through generations. It connected people to their land, their community, and each other. And in its unassuming way, it was a testament to the ingenuity of those who thrive despite scarcity. As the pot empties and the last spoonful is savored, you feel a quiet admiration for the resilience of those who found warmth and sustenance in such a simple dish. Pottage may not grace the tables of fine dining establishments today, but its legacy lingers in every bowl of hearty stew, every pot of slow-cooked goodness that brings people together. The firelight dances on the walls, casting flickering shadows as the warmth of the stew settles into your bones. You lean back, imagining the countless meals shared over centuries, each one a small triumph over the challenges of the medieval world. And with that thought, the echoes of history fade into the quiet of the night, leaving you with a sense of connection to the past and its enduring flavors. The smell of baking bread wafts through your thoughts, drawing you into another medieval staple coarse hearty rye bread. Imagine yourself in a peasant's humble home, the fire crackling as a flat, dark loaf bakes on a stone hearth. This isn't the fluffy golden bread of modern bakeries, but a dense, chewy sustenance as integral to medieval life as the sun was to the fields. Bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, particularly for peasants who relied on it not just for calories, but for survival itself. Rye bread in particular was the bread of the common folk. Why rye? It was hardy and could grow in the cold, damp conditions of northern Europe where wheat often failed. Its earthy flavor and filling nature made it a reliable choice even if it wasn't considered the pinnacle of luxury. Picture yourself watching a medieval baker at work, their hands dusted with flour as they knead a rough, sticky dough. The recipe was straightforward: rye flour water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a bit of sourdough starter if they had it. Leavening agents were hit, or misyeast wasn't as widely understood then, so the bread was often dense and slightly sour. This wasn't just a loaf to be enjoyed fresh and fluffy. Rye bread was meant to last. Once baked, it hardened quickly, but this was a feature, not a flaw. A loaf could sustain a family for days, eaten in thin slices or soaked in broth to soften it. Hard bread had another advantage: it was less likely to spoil or attract pests, a crucial factor in an era without refrigeration. Imagine yourself at the village market where bread was sometimes used as currency. You see loaves stacked neatly, their dark crusts a testament to the communal ovens that dotted medieval villages. These ovens were often shared among households, with families taking turns to bake their week's supply. The act of baking itself became a social affair, a time for exchanging gossip and recipes. But not all bread was equal, and rye bread was often considered a necessity rather than a choice. The wealthy dined on fine white bread made from wheat flour known as manchet, while the poor made do with what they could grow. This disparity was so pronounced that bread became a symbol of class. The darker the loaf, the lower your social standing. Historians still debate whether this preference for white bread was rooted in taste or societal perception. Some suggest that white bread's softness and sweetness were genuinely preferred, while others argue it was simply a way to flaunt wealth. After all, wheat was harder to cultivate and more expensive to mill, making it a luxury item. Despite its humble nature, rye bread wasn't without its dangers. Ergot, a toxic fungus that thrived on rye in damp conditions, occasionally infiltrated the medieval food supply. Consuming ergot-tainted bread could cause severe symptoms, including hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. You shudder at the thought, imagining the panic that must have gripped villages during outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, the term for ergot poisoning. Still, rye bread was a cornerstone of survival. Its dense structure made it the perfect vessel for absorbing soups and stews, and its slight sourness complemented the flavors of salted fish or preserved meats. A slice could even double as a utensil, serving as a makeshift plate called a trencher. When the meal was done, the trencher was either eaten or fed to animals, nothing went to waste. You picture a family gathered around a table, their meal simple but satisfying: a loaf of rye bread, a bowl of pottage, and perhaps a small wedge of cheese. Each bite was a reminder of the hard work that went into producing food in an era where nothing came easily. Bread also played a spiritual role. It was a staple in religious rituals, from daily prayers to communion. The act of breaking bread held profound significance, symbolizing community and sustenance. For medieval peasants, bread wasn't just food, it was life itself, a tangible link between the earth and the divine. The story of rye bread is ultimately a story of resilience. It speaks to the adaptability of the human spirit, the ability to take what the land offers and turn it into something sustaining. As the crusty loaf cools on the hearth, you marvel at its simplicity and its significance, a small but vital piece of the medieval puzzle. The room feels warm and inviting, the scent of bread lingering in the air as you drift further into this world. You picture the countless loaves baked and shared over centuries, each one a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of those who came before. And with that thought, the scene fades, leaving you with the comforting weight of history and the enduring aroma of rye. Your next meal finds you squatting by the edge of a bubbling cauldron, the steam rising and carrying the earthy aroma of a thick, vegetable-packed pottage. This was medieval peasantry's culinary lifeline, a dish that was as versatile as it was enduring. Unlike the lavish feasts served at noble tables, pottage was a humble concoction, one that stretched ingredients to their limits and adapted to the rhythms of the seasons. The word pottage comes from the Old French potage, meaning something cooked in a pot. You can almost hear the crackling of the fire beneath the iron pot as you imagine the scene: a peasant woman stirring the thick mixture with a wooden spoon, her children playing nearby. In that pot, everything came together: leeks, onions, turnips, kale, and maybe a handful of barley or oats to give it body. The beauty of pottage lay in its simplicity. It wasn't a recipe, but a method, a way to combine whatever was available into a nourishing whole. If the garden yielded a bounty, the pottage overflowed with fresh greens. During leaner times, dried legumes and foraged herbs took center stage. You imagine plucking nettles or dandelion greens from a hedgerow, their sharp, fresh scents mingling with the heavier aroma of boiling root vegetables. Pottage wasn't just sustenance, it was an economic necessity. Meat was expensive and often reserved for the upper classes, but a cauldron of pottage could feed a family for days. Leftovers weren't merely reheated, they were transformed. Each day's addition of fresh ingredients created a dish that evolved over time, thickening and deepening in flavor. It wasn't unusual for a pot of pottage to remain on the hearth for days or even weeks, a perpetual stew that absorbed the essence of every ingredient added. Historians still argue whether pottage was primarily a survival food or a deliberate culinary choice. Some believe it was born purely out of necessity, a way to stave off hunger with whatever was on hand. Others suggest it became a cultural staple, a symbol of frugality and resourcefulness. Either way, pottage was more than just a meal, it was a lifeline. You glance into the pot, and the colors of the ingredients seem to tell a story of the changing seasons. In spring, pottage might be bright with young leeks and fresh herbs, while in winter it turned darker and heartier, filled with turnips and dried peas. The flavor was simple, perhaps seasoned with a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar if the household could afford it. Occasionally a bit of meat or fat found its way into the pot. Perhaps a bone from Sunday's roast, or a few scraps of bacon luxuries that lent a richness to the otherwise plain dish. You imagine the excitement this must have brought, the way the aroma of meat could transform an ordinary meal into a small celebration. For peasants, pottage was also communal. In villages, neighbors often gathered to share ingredients, pooling their resources to create a meal that was greater than the sum of its parts. You picture a group of women huddled around a steaming pot, laughing and gossiping as they added handfuls of greens and grains. In these moments, the act of cooking became an expression of solidarity, a way to bind the community together. The texture of pottage was thick and hearty, somewhere between a soup and a stew. It was eaten with a chunk of bread, or if bread was scarce, simply on its own. The warmth of the dish provided comfort, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, a hot meal could soothe the body and the soul. But pottage wasn't without its quirks. Some ingredients like wild garlic or sorrel could add unexpected bursts of flavor, while others like turnips had a reputation for being bland and unappealing. You imagine the occasional grimace as someone bites into a particularly fibrous root, a small reminder of the dish's utilitarian origins. Interestingly, pottage also played a role in medieval medicine. Certain herbs and spices were believed to have healing properties, and adding them to the pot was seen as a way to ward off illness. Sage for digestion, parsley for vitality, and thyme for respiratory health all became part of the medieval culinary toolkit. The enduring appeal of pottage lies in its adaptability. You find yourself marveling at the creativity of those who made it their ability to turn scarcity into sustenance. Even today, the idea of a one-pot meal feels familiar, a testament to the timelessness of this simple dish. As the cauldron bubbles on the hearth, you imagine the countless stories it has witnessed, the laughter of children, the quiet moments of prayer before a meal, the conversations that carried through the evening. Pottage wasn't just food, it was a reflection of life itself, a blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The warmth of the scene lingers as you close your eyes, the aroma of pottage wrapping around you like a soft blanket. It's a reminder that even the simplest meals can hold the richest memories, their flavors echoing across the centuries. You wake to the faint sound of church bells tolling across the village, a gentle summons to the day's toil and prayers alike. Today's meal, if you can call it that, is a humble fare. Black bread and a slice of hard cheese eaten before dawn to give you strength for the fields. It's a far cry from the honey-glazed pastries of nobles, but this dense rye bread baked in a communal oven holds its own gritty charm. The coarse crust crunches beneath your teeth, releasing a subtle tang from the sourdough starter, a staple of peasant kitchens. Cheese, usually from sheep or goats tended by your neighbors, adds a salty creaminess that lingers on your tongue. Black bread was the peasant's daily companion, its dense, dark crumb providing lasting energy through long hours of labor. Unlike the pale wheat loaves reserved for the wealthy, this bread was baked from rye barley or even acorns during times of scarcity. It might not win any awards for delicacy, but it kept bellies full and spirits steady. You can almost feel the grit of bran between your teeth, a reminder that this was food with substance, no frills attached. Oddly enough, some medieval peasants believed that bread made with rye had mystical properties. Some whispered that rye bread could ward off evil spirits or cure minor ailments when eaten with the prayer. Whether true or superstition, these beliefs wove food and faith into a single comforting ritual. In fact, bread was so central to peasant life that breaking it together symbolized trust and community, a gesture that still echoes in modern toasts and shared meals. Cheese, on the other hand, was more than a treat. It was a practical necessity. The process of turning milk into cheese extended the life of a highly perishable resource, and cheeses varied widely from region to region. Some were crumbly and sharp, others soft and mild, but all carried the unmistakable tang of the countryside. Shepherds took pride in their cheese-making skills, often passing down secret techniques along with family stories. You might even catch a whiff of herbs or wild garlic mixed in to give the cheese a little zing. Interestingly, historians still argue whether medieval peasants relied more heavily on dairy than previously thought. Recent evidence suggests that cheese and milk products formed a larger part of the diet than the dry, starchy grains often emphasized. Maybe that morning slice of cheese was a daily luxury, not just a survival tactic. This simple breakfast, while humble, was part of a daily rhythm that sustained communities. The texture of the bread, dense and chewy, combined with the creamy cheese, grounded you a reminder that even the plainest food could nourish both body and soul. You can almost hear the crunch of crust on stone floors, the murmur of morning prayers, and the steady beat of a day about to begin. And yet not all bread was created equal. There are quirky tales of peasants who sneaked ingredients like herbs, nuts, or even bits of dried fruit into their loaves, transforming a simple staple into a flavor adventure, albeit a rare one. One legend tells of a baker who accidentally used ground nettles instead of herbs and inadvertently created a bread said to sharpen the senses, much to his customers' surprise. You picture yourself dipping that hard cheese into a mug of weak ale, another staple of peasant life, adding moisture and flavor to the dry bread. Ale was the everyday drink safer than water, and a mild stimulant to ease the day's burdens. It was brewed in homes from barley or oats, sometimes flavored with herbs, and was usually low in alcohol content. Far from the drunken revelry of tavern scenes, this ale was a nutritious part of the diet consumed by young and old alike. You catch yourself wondering about the texture contrast, the brittle crust giving way to soft, sometimes crumbly cheese, all washed down with the slightly sour, yeasty taste of ale. It's a sensory experience rooted in survival, but carrying an unexpected warmth, a moment of comfort before the fields call you again. In this daily simplicity, there's a profound connection to the land and a community. Black bread and cheese may seem like nothing to modern palates, but in the medieval world, they were the anchors of life binding together nutrition, faith, and culture. And sometimes, just sometimes, that humble meal offered a quiet joy, a reminder that even cheap meals could sustain not just the body, but the enduring spirit of a people. You trudge through the muddy lanes of your village as the sun climbs higher, the smell of damp earth mixing with the faint scent of wild herbs growing in the hedgerows. By midday, hunger gnaws at you again. And today's meal is a simple pottage, a thick, bubbling stew made from whatever vegetables the garden yields, plus a handful of dried peas or beans, slowly simmered over a modest fire. This wasn't the stuff of feasts, but the hearty mix of grains and legumes, packed a necessary punch of protein and fiber-sustaining peasants through back-breaking labor. Pottage was the medieval equivalent of an all-day energy bar, eaten hot or cold, thick or thin, depending on the season and what was on hand. Some pottages were smooth and almost soup-like, while others resembled more of a stew with chunks of root vegetable like parsnips, turnips, or leeks. Herbs such as parsley, sage, or lovage might be tossed in to liven up the flavor, making the humble meal more bearable and sometimes even enjoyable. There's a curious fact that peasants often reused their pottage pot water as a drink, believing that the nutrients and essence of the vegetables infused into the broth offered additional health benefits. Not exactly gourmet, but practical. And let's be honest, if you had a long day ahead, you might just take what you can get. Interestingly, peasants didn't always eat their pottage with a spoon. Sometimes it was scooped up with chunks of bread, turning the meal into a sort of edible bowl. This practice minimized washing up, which was a boon in times when water was scarce or cold. Plus, it gave that stale bread a second life, soaking up the flavorful broth and softening into a comforting mush. Historians still argue whether pottage was more of a daily necessity or a deliberate culinary tradition, But either way, it was central to the medieval peasant diet. Some argue that the variety of ingredients and cooking styles across Europe make it hard to pin down a single typical pottage after all. What you found in an English village might differ vastly from a French or German peasant's pot. The social aspect of pottage can't be overlooked either. It was often cooked communally, with villagers gathering around a single fire or large pot in the manor's kitchen. This meant that the meal was not just about nutrition, but about connection, conversation, and survival as a community. You imagine the steam rising from the pot, the rhythmic clink of wooden spoons stirring the thick stew, and the murmur of voices sharing gossip and news while waiting for the meal to cool. The smell of simmering onions and herbs fills the air, mingling with the rough-hewn scent of smoke and wood. It's a humble but sensory-rich experience, a momentary pause in the endless cycle of work and rest. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some peasants believed that if you stirred your pottage clockwise, you'd attract good luck. Counterclockwise bad. So the act of eating was infused with ritual, a tiny charm against the unpredictabilities of medieval life. Superstitions like these weren't just quaint, they offered comfort when so many daily worries threatened to overwhelm. Sometimes the pottage contained wild greens like nettles or dandelion leaves, which were harvested from nearby fields and hedgerows. These bitter greens added vitamins and minerals, though they weren't always popular on the tongue. You can almost feel the tug between necessity and taste, the desperate ingenuity of peasants trying to stretch meager resources while keeping their bodies fed. As you lick the last bit of broth from your bread, you appreciate how this simple meal holds layers of meaning. Nutrition, culture, superstition, and community all simmered together in a pot over a smoky flame. It's far from fancy, but in its way it's a powerful testament to human resilience. You may smile at the thought of how peasants once joked about their pottage, calling it the eternal stew, because it seemed to last forever, passed from one day to the next, thickening and deepening in flavor. Or maybe just because they were too tired to cook something new. Regardless, this cheap meal keeps you going, fuel for body and soul. As you return to the fields, the village, the life that clings stubbornly to the soil beneath your feet. You wipe your hands on your rough linen tunic and follow the worn path toward the nearby woodlands where blackberries hang heavy in the late summer sun, their deep purple hue almost glowing against the green leaves. These wild fruits were a cheap, often overlooked snack for peasants, bursting with sweetness and a hint of tartness, a rare luxury in a diet mostly made up of grains and vegetables. You pick a handful, staining your fingers, savoring the momentary burst of flavor that hints at freedom beyond fields and hearth. Blackberries, along with other wild fruits like sloes and elderberries, were foraged rather than farmed, offering a valuable supplement to the peasant diet without any cost except the time it took to gather them. You probably wouldn't survive the medieval countryside without knowing your local berries and their seasons. It was a matter of both nutrition and survival. Interestingly, blackberries also had a medicinal reputation. Medieval herbalists believed the leaves could be brewed into a tea to soothe sore throats or reduce fever. You can almost imagine the village healer, a wise old woman with a basket full of herbs, gently instructing you on how to turn these berries into more than just a treat. But berries weren't just about nutrition or medicine, they were woven into the folklore and superstitions of the time. For example, some believe that picking blackberries after Michaelmas, September 29th, was unlucky, as the devil was said to have cursed the bushes after this date. This little nugget of superstition is a reminder of how closely daily life was tied to religious calendars and beliefs. Historians still argue whether the reliance on wild fruit significantly improved the nutritional intake of peasants, or if they were more of a seasonal indulgence, a brief break from the monotonous diet dominated by bread and pottage. Either way, foraging for blackberries and other wild fruits added an element of variety and pleasure to peasant life, which is important to remember when we tend to imagine their existence as bleak and flavorless. On a practical note, blackberries were also used to make simple preserves mixed with honey or sugar, if you were lucky enough to afford it, which helped extend their shelf life and provide a sweetener for otherwise bland foods. This early form of jam was a prized commodity often shared during celebrations or sold at markets. As you wander deeper into the woods, the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, you spot a family of children playing nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees as they chase after a stray dog. You recall that medieval peasants rarely had dedicated toys. Simple games and natural surroundings served as entertainment. A handful of berries might have been a coveted prize in their games. You might also appreciate the subtle interplay of nature and necessity here. While peasants labored in the fields, the wild landscape provided edible gifts that required knowledge, patience, and respect to harvest sustainably. The balance between cultivated crops and wild resources was delicate and essential. One quirky detail: some peasants believed that eating blackberries could improve your eyesight, probably wishful thinking, but an endearing reminder of how folk wisdom mixed with necessity. And perhaps it was this kind of hopeful thinking that helped them face daily hardships with a little more optimism. The scent of earth and ripe fruit mingles in the air as you fill your palm with berries and begin the walk back to the village, your hunger momentarily sated by the sweetness of nature's bounty. The simplicity of this act, plucking fruit from the hedgerow, feels like a small rebellion against the strict routines of medieval peasant life. You might chuckle to yourself imagining a medieval peasant. Instagram account, a Sadler's berry hunter. Yes, medieval snacks. Cheap and cheerful. Not quite the influencer life, but maybe more authentic. You finish your berries just as the church bell tolls for evening prayers, signaling the end of the day's labor, and the time to gather once more around the hearth. The sweetness lingers, a quiet reminder that even in the harshest of times there were moments of joy and flavor. Remember that berries, simple as they seem, tell a story not just of survival but of connection to the land, to tradition, and to the small pleasures that keep the spirit alive. The sun climbs higher, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifts through the village, teasing your senses as you approach the communal oven. A large stone structure blackened with soot and the endless passage of wood smoke. For medieval peasants, bread was not just food. It was life itself, the cornerstone of every meal and a symbol of daily toil and community. Today, you're about to discover one of the simplest, cheapest, and most sustaining meals they relied on: barley bread. Barley, unlike wheat, was hardy and grew well in poor soil, making it a staple for peasants who couldn't afford the finer flours reserved for nobility. The coarse grain gave the bread a dense texture and a nutty flavor, quite unlike the fluffy white bread we imagine from medieval feasts. It's the kind of bread you chew slowly, appreciating its humble character. Interestingly, barley bread was often mixed with other grains or even peas and beans to stretch the dough further. Practical economics long before meal prepping was a thing. It wasn't just about feeding yourself, it was about feeding your family and your community. That communal oven was a hub where gossip, news, and recipes were shared as often as the heat from the fire warmed the cold morning air. Peasants typically baked their bread in large batches, and it would last for days. To avoid wasting the tougher, stale crusts, creative cooks would soften them in pottage or broth, a frugal tradition that shows how no crumb went unused. This recycling of food might sound unappealing now, but back then it was essential to survival. Here's a quirky tidbit: some medieval bakers would add crushed herbs like dill or fennel seeds to their bread dough. Not only did this flavor the bread, but it was also believed to aid digestion, a practical fusion of taste and health. Historians still argue whether barley bread was truly a staple across all regions, or if it was more common in northern, less fertile lands where wheat was scarce. Regardless, it was certainly a cheap and reliable food source eaten daily by millions of peasants. You watch a village woman pulling a round loaf from the oven with a long wooden peel, her hand steady despite the heat. The golden crust crackles slightly as she sets it on the stone slab to cool. You can almost feel the warmth radiate, a reminder of how precious even this modest loaf was. In a corner, a group of children nibble on scraps of bread and cheese, their faces flushed from running and play. It's a reminder that bread fed not only bodies but spirits, bringing a semblance of comfort and normalcy amid hard lives. And speaking of comfort, there's a peculiar medieval belief you might enjoy bread was sometimes considered sacred, even imbued with protective powers against evil spirits. Some peasants would hide crumbs in their homes or under pillows as talismans, tiny daily miracles baked right into the crust. As you break off a piece and taste the bread, its simplicity grounds you, connecting you to countless generations who lived and loved through similar meals. You might even chuckle imagining the medieval version of a bread influencer, praising the virtues of barley over wheat, hashtag chassis rustic realness. You tuck the bread into your bag, ready to move on, grateful for the way something so plain could sustain so much life and tradition. It's a quiet celebration of resilience baked into every crumb. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows over the fields as you find yourself walking toward a humble farmhouse where the smell of simmering stew beckons like a warm invitation. Here the medieval peasant's trusty pottage simmers in a large iron cauldron, a dish that might sound plain but was anything but boring. This thick, hearty stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and scraps of meat were available was the ultimate cheap meal, simple filling and endlessly adaptable. Pottage was the backbone of the peasant diet because it could be stretched to feed a whole family and was easy to prepare over an open fire. The stew often contained onions, leeks, carrots, beans, and sometimes wild greens like nettles or dandelion leaves. Meat was a rare luxury, but even a small bone or bits of salted pork could add a rich, smoky flavor. You notice the cook stirs the bubbling pot with a wooden spoon, lifting the steam to reveal a thick, brownish liquid, flecked with herbs and chunks of root vegetables. There's a rustic charm in this simplicity, no fancy spices, no elaborate cuts, just honest food that nourished from dawn till dusk. Curiously, peasants also used pottage as a way to sneak in less appetizing ingredients. Think insects or animal offal that modern palates might recoil from, but which were vital sources of protein and nutrients. This nose-to-tail philosophy long predates today's foodie trends, although you might want to pass on that particular recipe. There's also an unexpected regional twist in some areas. Peasants added wild herbs like lovage or savory, which gave the pottage a surprisingly complex flavor. These plants were foraged from hedgerows, showing how intimately peasants knew their environment and how they relied on nature's pantry. Historians still argue whether pottage was considered a humble meal or a celebratory dish in certain festivals, since richer versions with meat or fish were sometimes prepared for special occasions, blurring the line between everyday sustenance and feasting. Watching the simmering pottage, you recall that this dish was often eaten with coarse barley or rye bread used to scoop up the thick stew. The process is messy but satisfying, much like the medieval life itself, rough around the edges but deeply fulfilling. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval peasants believed that eating pottage made from certain plants could improve your mood or protect you from illness, giving food a medicinal role beyond mere calories. As you take a slow breath, savoring the hearty aroma, you realize that pottage is more than just a cheap meal. It's a symbol of adaptability and communal survival. It's the culinary embodiment of making do with what you have and finding warmth and comfort even in the simplest of pots. The farmer lad offers you a taste, and as you sip the broth, You can almost feel the history simmering in the flavors, generations of labor care and quiet resilience in every spoonful. You smile knowing that while you might not want to live entirely on pottage, the medieval peasants who did had an unshakable spirit, strengthened by this humble, steamy bowl. As the evening deepens and the village settles into the soft glow of dusk, you wander toward a small garden tucked behind a modest cottage. Here, the humble pea staple of the medieval peasant's diet awaits your attention. You might think peas are just a simple side dish, but in the Middle Ages they were a cheap, reliable source of protein and fiber, especially when meat was scarce. Fresh peas were eaten in season, but dried peas were the real star of peasant meals. They could be stored through long winters and boiled into thick, filling soups or stews. This dried pea soup was a cornerstone of survival, transforming humble pulses into a nourishing feast that could keep a family going through harsh times. Interestingly, peas were also sometimes ground into flour and mixed with barley or rye to stretch bread dough, a frugal trick that showed peasants' knack for making the most of every crop. You might think that sounds a little odd, but imagine the satisfying crunch of a freshly baked loaf with tiny bits of pea flour hiding inside. You watch a woman at the garden's edge shelling peas into a wooden bowl. The rhythmic sound is soothing like nature's own lullaby. Her weathered hands tell stories of countless seasons spent coaxing life from the soil, harvesting this simple yet vital crop. One quirky fact: medieval peasants sometimes believed that peas had magical properties, protecting against curses or bad luck if hung in bundles above the hearth. It's a charming reminder of how food and folklore were intertwined in everyday life. Historians still argue whether peas were introduced widely enough in medieval Europe to influence peasant diets uniformly, or if their importance was more localized depending on climate and soil conditions. Either way, peas made a meaningful difference to those who ate them. You notice that dried pea soup was often flavored with whatever herbs were available: parsley, sage, or even wild garlic, adding a surprising punch to what could otherwise be a very plain meal. As you taste a spoonful, the thick, earthy flavor grounds you. This is not a gourmet delicacy, but a bowl full of history and endurance. The texture is a little grainy, a little gritty, but deeply satisfying in a way that only simple food can be. You might laugh at the idea of peas being considered magical, but given how essential they were to survival, it's easy to see why peasants trusted in their power, both nutritional and spiritual. With a final glance at the pea pods swaying gently in the evening breeze, you tuck the image away, another small window into the past's humble but heroic kitchens. You step out of the garden and make your way toward the village hearth, where the scent of freshly baked bread mingles with the faint smokiness of the fire. Bread, the cornerstone of medieval peasant meals, is more than just food, it's a symbol of life itself. But don't imagine fluffy, airy loaves. Peasant bread was dense, coarse, and often made from barley, rye, or oats rather than wheat, which was reserved for the wealthier classes. Barley bread in particular was a staple because barley grew well, even in poor soils and harsh climates. You bite into a thick slice, its chewy texture filling your mouth with nutty, earthy flavors. It's not a delicate treat, but a hearty fuel to keep you going through the long, grueling day. You notice that bread wasn't just eaten alone. Medieval peasants often dunked it into pottages or soups to soak up every last bit of nourishment. This practice was practical. Nothing went to waste in a world where food security was always on the edge. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, leftover bread was sometimes given to pigs or used to feed chickens, closing the food loop and supporting the whole household economy. So even when you think the meal is done, bread still plays a part in survival. Also, peasant bread was often flavored, or perhaps masked is a better word, by whatever herbs or wild greens were on hand. Nettles, dandelion leaves, or wild garlic might find their way into the dough, adding bitterness or pungency depending on the season. Historians still argue whether the quality of peasant bread deteriorated steadily over the medieval period due to soil exhaustion and over-farming, or if peasants developed adaptive techniques that kept their bread reasonably nutritious despite hardships. One lesser-known fact: bread was sometimes used ceremonially, symbolizing community and sharing in the village. Breaking bread together wasn't just about eating, it was a reaffirmation of bonds and mutual support. As you wrap your fingers around a warm slice, you recall that even though bread was plain and simple, it carried immense cultural and practical weight. It was a daily ritual, a sacred necessity, and a humble luxury all rolled into one. So the next time you grab a sandwich or a slice of artisan bread, think back to that dense, coarse barley loaf. Peasant bread, the backbone of survival for centuries. You wander toward the fields where the sun dips lower and shadows stretch long, ready to harvest another humble yet vital meal: pottage. Imagine a thick, bubbling stew, a mixture of whatever roots, grains, vegetables, and sometimes bits of salted meat the peasants can scrounge. Pottage is the unsung hero of medieval peasant cuisine, cheap, adaptable, and nourishing enough to fuel hard work. Peasants often grew legumes like peas and beans alongside grains, and these were tossed into the pot to thicken the stew and boost protein content. Barley or oats might be added too, turning pottage into a porridge-like consistency that sticks to the ribs. You might imagine a drab, muddy bowl, but each village had its own twist, some adding wild garlic leeks or onions when in season. A little-known fact: some peasants flavored their pottage with greaves. The leftover bits of fat from rendering pork scraps most would consider scraps, but for the savvy they were flavor gold. Greaves added richness and calories to an otherwise plain meal. In some regions, pottage was eaten cold or reheated multiple times, meaning the flavors evolved daily, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. It wasn't a glamorous dish, but it was life-sustaining. Here's a quirky tidbit in England. Some peasants kept pottage simmering all day in a communal pot over the hearth, adding scraps throughout the day, a primitive slow cooker of sorts. This created a thick, almost stew-like dish by evening, perfect for sharing. Historians still argue whether pottage was primarily a meal of subsistence, or if it ever gained a celebratory or ritual significance in medieval peasant society, especially during harvest festivals. What's more, pottage often doubled as a way to make use of foraged wild foods. Nettles, dandelion leaves, mushrooms, and wild herbs found their way into the pot, bringing seasonal variety and vital nutrients. You might chuckle thinking about how modern superfoods are just a fancy rebrand of these same wild greens peasants ate out of necessity. In the flickering firelight of a humble peasant home, the thick steam rising from the communal bowl of pottage was a reminder of shared struggle endurance, and the quiet creativity required to survive on the margins. So next time you stew a soup, or simmer a pot, tip your hat to the medieval peasants whose unglamorous pottage laid the foundation for centuries of communal meals. You follow the narrow dirt track winding between the scattered cottages, the faint scent of smoke mingling with damp earth. As the day cools, you glimpse a group gathered around a simple wooden table, their hands busy preparing another staple of medieval peasant fare: flatbread. But not the fancy loaves you imagine in the great halls. These are humble, thin, unleavened rounds made from whatever grain was most readily available. Barley, rye, or oats often stood in for the more expensive wheat, which was mostly reserved for the wealthy. These flatbreads, sometimes called malt breads or sippets, were the reliable vehicle for whatever else filled a peasant's plate. You see a woman deftly mixing coarse flour with water, occasionally pressing the dough between her palms before patting it thin and round. The flatbreads bake quickly on a hot stone or a metal griddle, their edges curling and browning unevenly. The texture is rustic, chewy, and perfectly suited to tearing off pieces to scoop up pottage or smear a smear of sharp cheese if there's any to be had. It's easy to underestimate how vital this basic bread was. It was a daily staple that made all other dishes edible and filling. One quirky detail in colder regions, some peasants layered flatbreads with bits of cured fish or cheese, creating what might be considered an ancient version of a quick sandwich. Not exactly gourmet, but practical and delicious in its own way. You might imagine that these flatbreads were always plain, but some peasants were surprisingly creative. Evidence exists that wild herbs, thyme, rosemary, or even stinging nettles were sometimes kneaded into the dough to add flavor and nutritional value. A crunchy herbal flatbread in the early morning might be the medieval equivalent of a fancy brunch, albeit with a lot less caffeine. Historians still argue whether flatbread's widespread use was solely a matter of poverty and practicality, or if it also held symbolic or ritual value in rural communities, especially during religious festivals where bread often played a central role. Beyond just sustenance, bread was a social currency. Peasants often traded portions of their daily bread with neighbors or in market exchanges, and breaking bread remained a powerful symbol of community and trust. Another fascinating tidbit: in some places when wheat was scarce or rationed, peasants experimented with millet bread or even acorn bread, grinding wild nuts and seeds to stretch their flour supply. The taste was bitter but necessary, and the process was labor-intensive, a true mark of medieval resilience. As you watch the flatbreads puff and brown on the griddle, the scene reminds you of how simple ingredients combined with patience and skill formed the backbone of peasant life. These flatbreads didn't just fill stomachs, they connected people to their land, to their neighbors, and to a cycle of survival passed down through generations. You might also chuckle at the thought that while kings feasted on fine pastries, peasants found joy and sustenance in a thin, rough round of bread, proving once again that the difference between luxury and necessity is often just a matter of perspective. Later you see children playing with pieces of stale flatbread, tossing crumbs to the chickens, who eagerly peck at their unexpected feast. The flatbread's role extended beyond the table, supporting the entire ecosystem of the village. When the sun dips below the horizon and the sky blushes with fading light, the flatbreads cool on wooden boards ready to be stored for the next meal. They might become the midday snack, the travel rations, or the base for a reheated stew. Their durability was just as important as their taste. So next time you toast a simple piece of bread, think of these medieval flatbreads, rough, rustic, and utterly essential. They're the humble heroes of a daily grind that kept communities alive through good seasons and bad. You wander now toward the village green, where the low hum of daily life is punctuated by the sharp clink of metal tools and the occasional murmur of voices bargaining over goods. Here at the edge of the open marketplace, you find peasants gathered around large earthenware pots, simmering over simple hearth fires. These are the makers of a beloved, thrifty dish known as pottage. The word alone conjures images of thick, hearty stews, bubbling with whatever vegetables, grains, and scraps of meat or fish could be scavenged, foraged, or afforded. Pottage was the cornerstone of the medieval peasant diet, cheap filling and endlessly adaptable. Your senses immediately catch the smoky aroma mingling with the earthiness of root vegetables and fresh herbs. Peasants ladle out generous portions into wooden bowls, ready to be eaten hot or saved for later. Pottage wasn't just a meal, it was a slow-cooked narrative of the season, telling tales through ingredients from wild greens, picked on the edge of the woods, to small chunks of salted pork, preserved from the last pig slaughter. The texture ranges from nearly soup-like to a thick, almost porridge consistency, depending on how much grain or legumes were added. One historical fact to chew on by the late Middle Ages pottage recipes were documented in some household manuscripts indicating its cultural importance, even if it remained a simple peasant staple. These recipes varied wildly across regions, shaped by what the local soil and climate allowed. Now for the quirky details, some medieval peasants added crushed snails to their pottage, not because they were culinary connoisseurs, but because snails were a cheap, protein-rich addition. Snails were farmed in special escargot pens near some estates, but peasants often foraged them freely. It sounds like a strange choice today, but in a world where every calorie counted, snail meat was a surprisingly common filler. You might gag a little imagining that, but hey, it beats scavenging roots that might kill you. Another odd tidbit: monks sometimes lent their culinary expertise to pottage preparation, adding rare spices or even herbs with medicinal properties. Some of these recipes were considered both food and medicine, especially during the frequent medieval illnesses that swept through villages. A spoonful of pottage could be a comfort and a cure, or at least that was the hope. Historians still argue whether pottage was primarily a peasant necessity, or if it also held symbolic value as a communal dish served during festivals or religious observances to bind villagers together in shared hardship and celebration. You notice the peasants passing around a small wooden container filled with coarse salt, a precious commodity that could transform a bland pottage into something more palatable. Salt was often bartered for or saved for months, its scarcity a constant reminder of the challenges in preserving and flavoring food. Pottage's ingredients were as flexible as the seasons permitted in the early spring. Wild garlic and nettles might flavor the stew, while late autumn brought the last of the dried beans and root vegetables. Some peasants even used bitter dandelion leaves, disguising their sharpness with a good dose of vinegar or herbs. If you think pottage sounds a little dull, consider this: peasants were innovators in their own right. Some added crushed walnuts or hazelnuts to thicken the stew, boosting calories and flavor. Others would include bits of stale bread soaked into the broth, creating a satisfying texture, much like a modern-day bread soup. You watch a small child sneak a piece of the coarse, crusty bread into the pot, smiling mischievously before being caught by a watchful grandmother. That kind of thriftiness was not just tolerated, but celebrated. Waste was a sin when survival was on the line. Another amusing fact: in some regions, pottage was even eaten cold, especially during hot summer months or when the firewood was scarce. Imagine a cold stew as your lunch. It's not haute cuisine, but it gets the job done. As you stand among the crowd, you see the slow exchange of stories, laughter, and shared struggles over bowls of steaming pottage. It's a dish that nourishes more than just the body, it feeds the communal spirit. And remember, when you think of medieval peasants eating their humble meals, don't picture endless monotony. Their resourcefulness in stretching every grain, every root, and every scrap of food into pottage was an art form, one that survived centuries of hardship. Finally, a touch of grim humor. It's said that sometimes pottage was flavored with a dash of medieval ketchup, a sauce made from fermented fish guts called garum, which had been imported from the Roman era. To modern noses, the idea might be stomach-churning, but for medieval palates, it added umami and depth. You might think of it as an acquired taste that only the most desperate or adventurous peasants braved. As the sun lowers, casting long shadows over the village green, you feel the warmth from the pottage hearth seep into your bones, a quiet comfort amid the unpredictability of medieval life. The stew is a reminder of endurance, creativity, and the daily battles fought quietly in kitchens across Europe. So next time you're tempted to complain about reheated leftovers, consider the medieval peasant whose survival depended on a pot simmering over an open flame, turning humble scraps into sustenance that was as much about hope as hunger. You step beyond the market bustle, the sun dipping low in the sky, and find yourself wandering toward the modest cottage at the village's edge, where the day's labor will soon yield its final reward. A simple supper of bread and cheese, the last cheap meal on our list, but far from the least. This humble pairing was a medieval peasant staple, a reliable ending to long, exhausting days, a symbol of sustenance and simplicity that carried an entire world of meaning. The bread before you is nothing like the fluffy white loaves modern kitchens produce. Instead, it is dense, heavy, and made from coarse grains, usually rye barley or oats, sometimes mixed with bits of bran or chaff. This bread, often baked in communal ovens or simple clay ovens built at the back of cottages, was rough but filling, providing the bulk of the peasant diet's calories. Its crust crackles under the touch, slightly burnt in places from a fiercely hot fire, and inside it's a chewy crumb that can withstand dipping into pottage or thick soups. Now the cheese beside it is equally modest, hard, crumbly, and salty, made from cow's, goats, or sheep's milk, depending on the region. Unlike the soft, creamy cheeses you might expect today, medieval peasant cheese was designed to last. It was often aged for weeks or months, making it dry and sharp, more a source of protein and fat than a luxury to savor. Yet this cheese was treasured for the energy it provided during cold winters and long hours in the fields. One historical fact to keep in mind: in many villages, peasant households kept small herds of goats or sheep precisely to make cheese, as cows were a bigger investment and reserved for wealthier farms. The cheese's texture and flavor could vary wildly depending on the milk source and the herbs added during production. Sometimes wild thyme or nettles were mixed in to give it a peculiar earthy note. Now, for some quirky bits, peasants occasionally flavored their cheese with garlic, or buried it in ash to protect it from insects, an ancient preservation technique that also added a smoky tang. Imagine munching on a piece of ash-coated cheese. It's rustic and you might grit your teeth a bit, but it was a necessary evil to keep food safe and edible. Another amusing tidbit is that cheese could double as a kind of barter currency. Peasants often traded their homemade cheese with neighbors or itinerant merchants in exchange for tools, cloth, or spices. Cheese was so valuable that some records show peasants hiding their wheels in secret places to keep them from being stolen, because even in the Middle Ages, everybody knew the power of good snacks. Historians still argue whether bread and cheese alone provided enough nutrition, or if peasants risked malnutrition relying so heavily on these staples. Some say the addition of pottage vegetables and the occasional meat or fish was crucial to stave off scurvy, rickets, and other dietary deficiencies. Others point out the sheer hardship of peasant life meant many went hungry despite these staples. As you nibble a piece of the bread and cheese, you notice how the simplicity invites creative additions. Honey, when available, could sweeten a slice, while wild herbs brought freshness. Some peasants even rubbed their bread with garlic or dipped it in sour wine vinegar, creating a flavor contrast that feels surprisingly modern. You overhear conversation about how medieval peasants sometimes baked tiny bread dolls or shaped dough into animals or symbols, not just as decoration but as tokens in folk rituals. These shapes might be blessed by a priest or kept in the home for protection or luck. It's fascinating to think that something as everyday as bread could carry mystical meaning. Another quirky fact: some peasants believed that eating bread crust was good for their health, especially in the winter months, because the crust contained the life force of the grain. You might chuckle at that one, but it's a reminder that food was more than sustenance. It was tied to belief and tradition. You might be surprised to learn that even bread was occasionally rationed or controlled by local lords or monasteries, especially in times of famine or war. This could turn a simple meal into a political act, with peasants sometimes punished for baking illegal loaves or using forbidden grains. Food was power, and even cheap meals were part of a larger system of control. Watching the villagers settle down to eat, you see the unspoken rhythm of medieval life in their hands. The quick tearing of bread, The slow savoring of cheese, the quiet sharing of a meal, hard-earned. It's a reminder that survival was often about making do, and that simple ingredients carried the weight of generations. You recall a fringe tidbit about medieval bread being used in healing poultices crumbled, and mixed with herbs bread could soothe wounds or ease fevers? It might sound odd to modern ears, but food as medicine was a common concept, blurring the lines between kitchen and infirmary. As night falls and stars begin to sprinkle the sky, the cottage grows quiet except for the crackle of the dying fire and the soft breathing of those at rest. The cheap meals we have traced from thin gruels and root vegetables to hearty pottage and sturdy bread and cheese have sustained countless lives, their stories woven into the very fabric of medieval survival. Historians still debate whether the peasant diet was more a reflection of poverty or resilience. Some see these meals as desperate and grim, others as evidence of ingenious adaptation. Perhaps it was a bit of both, shaped by necessity, but also by the enduring human spirit to find nourishment and comfort in even the humblest fare. So as you lay your head down tonight, think of those who lived centuries ago, filling their bellies with the simplest of foods, yet rich in history, culture, and survival. Remember, the smells, the textures, the quiet moments by the fire. Their meals were far from gourmet, but they were life itself, gritty, real, and unyielding. And if you're feeling adventurous tomorrow morning, maybe toast a slice of rye bread, smear on a bit of sharp cheese, and take a tiny bite of history. It might not win any culinary awards, but it sure connects you to a world that thrived on cheap meals and stubborn hope. You're almost at the end of this long, winding journey through the daily diets of medieval peasants, those hardy souls who eked out existence on the simplest of meals. But before we close our eyes and drift off, let's spend some time savoring the last few crumbs of understanding about the food that kept them alive. And sometimes just barely so. This final chapter isn't just a list. It's a meditation on survival culture and the strange beauty of scarcity. You settle down beside a glowing hearth inside a modest peasant home. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Outside the village is quiet under a blanket of stars. Inside, you watch as a mother spreads out a thin piece of oat cake, one of the final cheap meals you'll explore the last comfort for the day. Oat cakes made from ground oats, water, and salt were a staple in many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the colder, harsher climates like Scotland or northern England. They were unleavened flat and cooked on a griddle or flat stone, making them quick and cheap to prepare. Unlike the dense rye or barley bread, oatcakes had a lighter texture but were just as hearty. You'd be forgiven for thinking of them as the medieval equivalent of crackers or flatbreads, but they were so much more a basic portable source of energy that could be eaten plain, or with whatever little toppings were available. One interesting historical fact is that oatcakes were often carried by travelers and soldiers because of their durability. They didn't spoil easily, and their simplicity made them a reliable field ration. This was a big deal in a time when food preservation was a constant challenge. A quirky tidbit: peasants sometimes ate oatcakes with sowons, a sour fermented oat porridge that sounds unappetizing, but was a valued source of vitamins. The sourness came from natural fermentation, which also helped preserve the oats. Think of it as an ancient probiotic snack. Not quite the smoothie bowls of today, but hey, the benefits were there. Another oddity you'd appreciate: oatcakes could double as utensils. When soup or pottage was thick enough, pieces of oatcake were torn off and used to scoop up the food, a sort of edible spoon or bowl. Multi-purpose food is the original life hack. Historians still debate whether oatcakes were more common among the poor due to affordability or simply a matter of regional agricultural suitability. The argument swings between economic necessity and environmental adaptation, a classic medieval food mystery. Moving on, you notice the humble importance of eggs in the peasant diet. Chickens were a common sight, and though keeping poultry required some care and space, eggs were an accessible protein source. You probably didn't get to eat eggs every day, though. They were prized, and families often saved most eggs for hatching or trade. One fascinating historical note is that eggs were sometimes preserved by packing them in ash or storing them in cool, damp cellars to extend their shelf life. This storage technique shows the resourcefulness of peasants in managing their limited resources. A quirky bit to imagine during harsh winters, peasants sometimes boiled eggs and dyed them with natural plant pigments. Perhaps a hint of early festive traditions, though Easter eggs in the modern sense were more a church celebration. The colors and decorations might have had folk significance even then. Another fringe note is the belief in some villages that eating eggs with certain herbs could improve fertility or health, a superstition blending nutrition and folk medicine. The overlap between diet and belief was strong. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants' egg consumption was sufficient to meet protein needs, or whether seasonal shortages led to cycles of deficiency. This question touches on larger debates about medieval health and nutrition. As the fire crackles, you contemplate the role of fish, especially salted or dried varieties, in peasant meals. Proximity to rivers, lakes, or the sea determined access, but fish was often cheaper than meat and more available, especially during fasting days dictated by the church. Salted fish like cod or herring was a major preservation breakthrough. Salt drew out moisture, preventing spoilage, and made it possible to stockpile fish for months. The smell wasn't always pleasant, but the nutrition was vital. A quirky historical detail: some peasants believed that eating salted fish on Fridays could cleanse the soul. Or at least that was the church-approved reason for fasting on meat. Of course, fish was often considered a poor man's meat, a consolation prize rather than a luxury. Another interesting tidbit: certain villages had festivals celebrating fish harvests, where salted fish were distributed or traded, emphasizing community bonds around scarce food resources. These festivals sometimes involved fish-themed folk songs or dances, a medieval party centered on survival. Historians still debate the actual nutritional impact of salted and dried fish on peasants' diets, especially since excessive salt could cause health issues while fish oils were crucial for brain and heart health. This balance remains a topic of scholarly discussion. Let's also linger on the tiny but important role of wild herbs and greens, often gathered from the fields or hedgerows. Nettles, dandelions, chickweed, these bitter but nutrient-rich plants were common additions to pottage or salads. Not gourmet but vital. One fascinating fact is that peasants' knowledge of edible plants was often passed down orally, with certain herbs believed to prevent illness or improve digestion. This body of folk wisdom was an informal pharmacy. A quirky detail is that some herbs were intentionally harvested for their magical properties. For example, yarrow was thought to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. Eating your salad with a side of superstition, then. Historians still debate how much medieval peasants relied on wild greens versus cultivated crops. Some evidence suggests wild plants were a dietary safety net during famines or crop failures. As you begin to wind down this chapter and this whole journey, you realize that these 15 cheap meals, from gruel to bread and cheese, from oatcakes to salted fish, were more than mere food. They were acts of endurance, stories of ingenuity, and threads in the fabric of medieval life. You probably won't survive a week on these diets today without some serious supplementation. But back then, this was the norm. These meals shaped bodies, communities, and cultures, a legacy hidden in the everyday. And now, wherever you are, as your eyes grow heavy and your mind drifts, remember the crackling fire, the smell of baking bread, the sharp tang of cheese, the sour bite of fermented oats, and the quiet dignity of those who lived by these simple, cheap meals. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.